everybody. Can you hear me? Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm Steve Pettyjohn, and I want to welcome you to, I don't know what number this is, of the World at War Forum sessions, but we're delighted to have you here tonight. We've got a really fascinating and hopefully fun subject, I think. But before I introduce Eric, I wanted to do some previews of coming attractions, as some things have changed a little bit. May 7th will still be the Marines in World War I, Belleau Wood and other subsequent battles. June 4 will be the first edition of a sub-series we're going to start called the GI Experience. And this will be at a different time. June 4th is a Tuesday, but we're going to start at 6 p.m. Because we're going to have a conversation with Mr. Dominic Visconsi, who is a 99-year-old veteran of the 10th Mountain Division, which served in Italy in World War II with some distinction, I might add. And his family's going to help us, and they indicated that maybe by 7:30 he's ready for bed. So, so we're going to start at 6, okay? It's going to be 6 on June 4th. And then in August, we're going to go where no World at War Forum has gone before, and that is we're going to have a meeting in August. And it's going to be August 6th, and the subject is going to be Korea. And Andrew Mangels, the director of the library here, is going to give his 2 years in the preparation Korean War presentation. Something has always happened to him whenever he's wanted to do it before, so hopefully we'll be okay with that. In September, we're going to have, I think, a very exciting presentation on Poland in World War II. And while the Nazis invaded on September 1, 1939 and captured Warsaw very quickly, the Polish people didn't give up. And this is going to be about everything they contributed to our winning World War II. In October, we're going to have a panel discussion on the Cuban Missile Crisis. In November, we're going to do the GI Experience, and it may be Korean War veterans, and it may be something on World War I and what the doughboys went through. We're working on that right now. And December will be the road to Pearl Harbor. Tonight, we're going to have some fun talking about Hollywood celebrities before they were famous. We have Mr. Eric Rivet. Rivet. There's 3 ways to pronounce it. I knew I'd get it right if I did it 3 times. But he's the chief curator at the Western Reserve Historical Society. And before that, has quite a career in historical museums. He was the chief curator at the...
one of the curators at World War II.
Okay, at the World War II Museum in New Orleans. He's also been a curator at the USS Kidd Destroyer Museum and the USS Slater Destroyer Escort Museum. So if you hear a note of naval history in there, we're hoping to have him come back and share some stories about World War II and the Pacific and things like that. So I'm going to turn this over to Eric now. Thanks for being with us.
Okay, well, good evening. Can everybody hear me in the back? Awesome. Okay, so it is Rivet, Eric Rivet. I grew up in South Louisiana. You won't hear much of an accent, and my wife, who is from up here, which is why I live up here now, has never forgiven me for that. So here we go. Today, we're going to do something that I hope is a little bit of fun. This is going to be an audience participation talk. So as we all know, about 16 million Americans served in World War II. Most of them just, your mom, your dad, my grandfather, my grandmother, they just, after 1945, came home and lived their lives. And they were just people who did extraordinary things. There were a surprising handful of people who served in World War II and then came home and became celebrities. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So this is an audience participation talk. So I am going to start off by, so to speak, priming the pump. And we're going to talk about a couple of people who were already celebrities who did serve in World War II. And from that point on, I am going to show you photos and tell you about the service of these men and women, and you have to figure out who they are. Some of them are going to be very, very easy. I mean, shockingly easy in a couple of cases. Some of them might be kind of tough, and there are a couple of them that if anybody gets them, I will come down and shake your hand, because I will be incredibly impressed if you figure out a couple of them. So let's jump right in. There is, of course, no better place to start than Jimmy Stewart. So that is Jimmy Stewart in The Philadelphia Story in 1940, which incidentally is the only film for which he won an Academy Award. We think of him as having this absolutely unstoppable career, but that's it. And of course, the woman he's with is Katharine Hepburn. Everybody knows that one. All right, so I would argue that he was probably the biggest celebrity to actually see combat in World War II. A couple of interesting things about Jimmy Stewart. He enlisted as a private in 1941. Now, he had a civilian pilot's license. He already knew how to fly when he joined the military. And so he trained as a B-24 pilot. So he flew Liberators, big 4-engine heavy bombers. He went over in 1943 as the commander of the 703rd Bomb Squadron. So he was in command of 12 planes. But by the end of the war, he was the commander of the 2nd Bomb Wing, which means he was now in command of 144 planes. Not bad for an actor. So he rose from the rank of private to colonel in 4 years. And when the Air Force became its own branch in 1947, he stayed in the reserves and retired as a brigadier general. So, yes?
Brigadier 1 star?
1 star. Yeah, 1 star. So, again, I mean, it doesn't get much more impressive than that. So, Jimmy Stewart.
What's that emblem in the right-hand corner?
That's the emblem of the 703rd Bomb Squadron. Which, thank you for pointing that out. So in most cases, the patches that you'll see are the patches to the divisions that people served in. In some cases, it's their rank. I'll try to point them out as we go along, but thank you for pointing that out. So again, that's the emblem for the 703rd Bomb Squadron. And his A2 flight jacket with that patch is at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, so you can go see it. And he was tall, by the way. He was 6'3", so it's a pretty big jacket. All right, next up, another very famous person, of course, Clark Gable. So Clark Gable, there is, of course, Gone with the Wind, Vivian Leigh. So, Clark Gable, pretty interesting story. So his wife, Carol Lombard, had tried to talk him into joining the military, and he kind of put it off and put it off and put it off. Unfortunately, Carol Lombard died in a plane crash in January of 1942. She was on a war drive, a Liberty Loan Drive tour, basically, trying to raise money. And she died in a plane crash just outside of Las Vegas. And so that kind of pushed Gable into joining the military. So he joined the Army Air Forces, went to OCS, Officer Candidate School, in 1942. In fact, one of the really cool things in the collection of the National World War II Museum when I was there, I'm sure they still have it, is we have, they have his class photo from his OCS class. So you can see him in uniform, minus the mustache. He had to shave for OCS. All right, so what he actually did was he was a combat cameraman. He was assigned to a B-17 group, and he was in command of a team of 5 guys, and they flew 5 missions over Europe and just filmed everything they could. They filmed from B-17s. So if you watch, well, you don't see history on the History Channel anymore, but back when you did, if you watch documentaries and you see combat footage of B-17s in the air, there's a pretty good chance that the film that you see was shot by Clark Gable and his team. He had a couple of very close calls. One of his men was wounded on a mission. He had a piece of flak that came through the plane and went through his boot, but did not hit him, luckily. But he flew 5 missions, and then he decided he had had enough. I mean, he was already, by the time he got overseas, he was already 43, 44 years old. And, you know, that's no place for a middle-aged guy. I mean, he was my age, come on. And so he got out of it, and he spent the rest of the war making essentially propaganda footage. Yes?
He hailed from, I believe, Akron, Ohio.
Ohio somewhere, yeah.
My uncle served in his unit.
Okay.
My uncle Tony served with, and they spent a lot of time together.
Well,
Yeah, and my Aunt Mary, they were very chummy. They
Yeah.
were, I mean, they just were.
so to answer your question, Ohio somewhere, but I don't think Akron. I think it was farther south, but I don't.
Cadiz.
Cadiz.
It is.
There you go, Cadiz. Yeah, that place. So, interesting thing you see down there at the bottom. So, I failed to mention that slide of Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind was one of Hitler's favorite movies. And so he actually offered a prize, a cash prize, to a German fighter pilot that could shoot down Clark Gable, but not kill him, which was not exactly the easiest thing to do when you're shooting at planes. But he wanted to capture Clark Gable, not because of the propaganda value, but because he wanted to meet Clark Gable. Clark Gable was one of his favorite actors, and what better way to use a world war than to meet, you know, your starry-eyed celebrity crush. It didn't work out that way. All right, so we're going to do one more. And that is, of course, David Niven. Now, before we get into David Niven, who's the guy on the right?
Errol Flynn.
Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn, I think, has one of the most interesting stories, and that is, of course, Errol Flynn. Everybody knows Errol Flynn, right? He's Captain Blood. He's Robin Hood. He is the Sylvester Stallone. He is the Arnold Schwarzenegger. He is all of these guys in the 1930s going into the 1940s. He is Mr. Action celebrity superstar. World War II begins in 1939. A lot of people are rushing to enlist and serve their country, and he wanted to do the same. But he had a problem, and that is he had already had the first of what would be a series of heart attacks that will eventually kill him. So in US military terms, he was 4F. Right? He could not serve because of his health. But he could not let word of that get out, because then there goes his career, right? I mean, this is a guy whose entire life is based on being in action movies. And no film studio is going to give him a job if there's a chance he's going to have a heart attack and die on set. And so he spent the entire war sitting out and getting absolutely ripped apart by the press. Because everybody else is serving, why isn't Errol Flynn? Right? And he had a perfectly valid reason for why he couldn't serve, but he couldn't let anybody know what that reason was. So you kind of almost have to feel bad for Errol Flynn in World War II. All right, so David Niven. One of my favorite actors, by the way. You're going to see it. You're going to learn a lot about me tonight by my selection of celebrities and movies and so on. Okay, so David Niven. Graduated from Sandhurst in 1930. So Sandhurst is the British equivalent of West Point. It is the officers' training school for the British Army. Much like at West Point, when he graduated, you get to basically fill out a form that says, you know, these are my top 3 picks. If I get to go where I want to go, these are the units that I would like to serve in. David Niven did something very interesting on his form. He said, you can put me anywhere you want except the Highland Light Infantry Regiment. And so the British Army did 2 things. They put him in the Highland Light Infantry Regiment, and then they gave the commanding officer of the regiment his form and said, hey, you'll find this interesting, check this out. And so his time in the British Army was hell. They made his life miserable, which is why only 3 years into his service he resigned his commission, decided he would give acting a try, moved to the United States, and became a celebrity. He's a very good actor. War starts in 1939. To his credit, he is one of the very first, if not the first, British actor to go back across to England from Hollywood to serve in the military. So he has military training. He is a professional officer, or was, and so they give him the most exciting job you could ask for. They put him in a motor pool. So he's in charge of trucks, basically. That is not exciting enough for David Niven, so he volunteers for the commandos. So, you know, the elite fighting forces of the British Army. He ends up in what's called a phantom unit, which is their special reconnaissance experts, reconnaissance and communications. And so that's what he's doing at the time of Normandy. He's in this very specialized, basically, scouting unit. And then ultimately he ends up as lieutenant colonel making propaganda films, kind of like Gable. And so he is going to come back up towards the end of the talk. All right, so there we go. The pump has now been primed. From here on out, yes?
Sorry to interrupt you, but someone's sitting here who knows something about Jimmy Stewart that you didn't get a chance to mention it before. Joyce, it's yours.
Oh, no, my uncle flew in his squadron.
Oh, wow.
And when my uncle retired from his civilian job, because they kept in touch, he sent him a very long letter about the old times and congratulations and so forth.
That's
and
nice.
That uncle was shot down in the North Sea.
Oh, wow.
You know, then the Queen, mother, the princesses, quite a life over there.
Very nice. They did not serve in the same group together, but they were in the same wing.
Yeah.
Somebody who became a celebrity after the war, Walter Matthau. Walter Matthau was a radio man gunner on B-24s as well. So there you go. All right, so here we go. Like I said, some of these will be a lot easier than others. So we have this guy. Served in the 3rd Infantry Division, the Rock of the Marne, that's the big patch up there. So drafted in 1943, served in the 3rd Infantry Division, same unit as Audie Murphy, and landed at Anzio. And at Anzio, he was very, very badly wounded. He was hit 9 or 10 times by a machine gun in his leg. And so he had to have major surgery. In fact, he had to undergo 9 operations to try to fix his leg. And that's just to keep from losing his leg, to say nothing about giving him good quality of life. Ended up becoming an actor, otherwise he wouldn't be in his PowerPoint. And his wound troubled him all throughout his career, especially when he rode horses, which is unfortunate because that was a really big part of his career. And so, of course, this is Jim Arness, absolutely, yeah. He was probably a pretty easy target because he was 6 foot 7 inches tall. All right, there you go. James Arness of Gunsmoke fame. So, interestingly, he actually held the record for quite a long time for the American actor that played the same character, if you exclude soap operas, which we're going to do just for fun, of playing the same character for the longest period of time. So he played Marshall Dillon for 20 years. That record has since been broken by, does anybody know?
Plays in Fiddler of the Roof, right?
No.
She played that.
Not Lucille Ball. This is a guy, he played the same character on 2 different shows, and the second show was actually just rebooted last year. Yeah, Kelsey Grammer. So Kelsey Grammer is the current record holder for an American actor. The record for, like the Guinness Book of World Record holder, this is just useless knowledge, is a British actor named William Roach who played the same character on a British soap opera for 62 years. 64 years, I'm sorry. So, yeah, he's 91 years old and still playing the same character he's played since 1960.
What about Richard Belzer?
Richard Belzer's got to be up there too. Yeah, Mariska Hargitay's got to be up there too. All right, so next up with this guy. The photo is not great, but that's the one I could find. So drafted in 1944, late 1944, he was in the 63rd Infantry Division. That's their patch up there. He was involved in the liberation of a concentration camp. He actually also saw a pretty significant amount of combat during his time overseas. Right after the war ended, so he is still overseas on occupation duty, he ran into a friend of his from back home, and they sat down and had lunch together. Unfortunately, this being a segregated country and a segregated army, his friend was black, and so that was not going to fly, and so this man was transferred to graves registration. So his job was then to attempt to identify, and then bury corpses. And he was started performing. He did a lot of singing, kind of give this away. But he took up the stage name Joe Barry, and while he was overseas, he got to a USO show and saw Bob Hope, famous Clevelander, and went up to Bob Hope afterwards and said, "Hey, I'm a singer too. My stage name is Joe Barry." And Bob Hope said, "You got to change that name. That's terrible." So yell it out. You all know it. Tony Bennett. Anthony Benedetto, by the way, is his real name. So there you go, Tony Bennett, who we just lost last year. But pretty impressive career, 109 albums, 83 singles between 1951 and 2023. So there you go. All right, next up, obviously we are talking about the guy on the right. This has come up before. It is the guy in uniform on the right. So he volunteered right after high school. He trained as a paratrooper. Usually we think of paratroopers, we think of the 82nd and the 101st Airborne. We actually had a couple more airborne divisions than that. We only had one that served in the Pacific, that's the 11th Airborne, which is what this man belonged to. He jumped into the Philippines, was wounded 3 times, and almost certainly suffered from undiagnosed PTSD from the rest of his life. Not actually known as an actor, though he did appear on screen in every episode of his show. He created a very, very famous show. Rod Serling, very good. Good crowd. So yeah, the creator of the Twilight Zone. So you can kind of get PTSD vibes really just from watching his show. All right, next up we have this guy. So, drafted into the Army after being in college, he was sent to the ASTP program. I'm sure most of you know what that is, but just in case you don't, ASTP is the Army Specialist Training Program. And that was a program that was set up to train people, train soldiers who were the best and brightest, because you need like intelligence officers, and you need interpreters, and you need guys who can operate and understand radar, and all of these very fancy things. And so what they did was they took the best and brightest guys who were entering the Army, and the Army paid for them to go to college. Now what happened was when the Battle of the Bulge started in December 1944, and the U.S. Army suffered 75,000 casualties in 1 month, all of a sudden the Army needed men from wherever it could get them. So they were taking clerks and cooks and sending them to the front lines to just kind of cover their gaps, and they canceled the ASTP program. So all of these guys who were basically sitting out World War II getting a free college education now all of a sudden found themselves in the front line holding rifles. And most of them were not happy about that, by the way. However, the opposite end of this is the guys who did not qualify for ASTP used to say that ASTP stood for All Safe Till Peace. And they had a pretty valid reason for being upset about that, because they are in the front lines while the best and brightest guys are at home and getting a free ride in college. So that was the story of this guy. He was in ASTP. ASTP is canceled. He finds himself in the front lines. He is attached to the 78th Infantry Division, and he's a combat engineer. So his job was basically to go out and find and defuse landmines, of which there were plenty. So he found no lack of work overseas. Anybody?
Mel Brooks.
Very good. Yeah. That's Mel Brooks, right? So, Young Frankenstein, one of my all-time favorite movies. History of the World Part 1, Good to be the King. Spaceballs, another great, great movie. Also, one of only 2 people in this talk who is still alive. All right, so like I mentioned, some of these are going to be really, really easy, right? Not the easiest one. The easiest one is coming up. All right, so interesting guy. So he was born in coal mining country in Pennsylvania. When he joined the Army, he had only just learned how to speak English. He did not grow up speaking English. He spoke actually 4 or 5 different languages, but English came pretty late in the game. So he had a very, very thick accent when he was in the Army Air Forces. So he served in the 61st Bomb Squadron. That's their patch up there as well. They flew B-29s out of Tinian, if I remember right, Guam, rather. And he flew 25 missions. He was, like a lot of these people and a lot of World War II veterans, never really talked about his service. So we don't know a whole lot. We know he flew 25 missions. We know he qualified for a Purple Heart, so somewhere along the way he was wounded on one of these missions. That's about it. So, yeah, everybody knows who this guy is. I've already heard it several times. Charles Bronson. So, Death Wish, that's a choice. And then the Dirty Dozen. The Dirty Dozen could be this talk unto itself, because practically everybody in that was a World War II veteran. And we'll talk about a couple more of those coming up. All right, so this one's a tougher one, but this might be the right crowd. So, kind of like Jimmy Stewart, this guy was already a pilot. So he was a civilian pilot when the war started. He flew B-17s in the Pacific. And probably the most interesting thing about his World War II service is that he survived not 1, but 2 plane crashes. Was sent back to the United States to become an air crash inspector, because what better person to inspect air wrecks than a guy who had already been in 2. After the war, he became a civilian pilot for Pan Am, where he was in not 1, but 2 plane crashes. So this guy survived 4 separate plane crashes. Then he became a police officer with the LAPD, and then he became a writer. So this is not an actor. So far as I'm aware, this guy was never in front of a camera, but he created one of the most popular television shows of all time, which has been around basically since it premiered in 1966, I think. And it has been, I don't even know how many different television shows now, how many versions. It has been movies. There's an animated series, at least 1. You're going to see a couple of people who were in the shows that he created. Anybody?
Roddenberry.
Gene Roddenberry, very good. The creator of Star Trek, flew B-17s during World War II. So interestingly, on the right there, that is, of course, Gene Roddenberry. Right next to him, standing up, of course, DeForest Kelley. DeForest Kelley served in the Army Air Forces in World War II. He was an air traffic controller in New Mexico, if I remember correctly. Leonard Nimoy was an Army Reserve officer in the 1950s. I think William Shatner served in the military as well, but that was in Canada, so that doesn't count. All right. So now we're getting to, I think this is one of the tougher ones. So this is an Austrian national, born in Austria, was no fan of Nazi Germany and Hitler's rise to power. Happened to be, just as luck would have it, he was in Switzerland when Germany took over Austria and the Anschluss in 1938. And so he decided, well, you know what, I probably should go back to Austria. So he immigrated to the United States. He volunteered for the Army Air Forces. So, I mean, this is a World War II crowd. The uniform that this guy is wearing is the uniform equivalent of a paratrooper. He was not a paratrooper. He was a supply sergeant in the Army Air Forces. But he's a pretty good looking guy. Kind of looks like Bill Murray, I think, honestly. Young Bill Murray. It is not Bill Murray. But, so anyway, so this is a recruiting poster that he was plucked to be the model for. But anyway, so supply sergeant in the Army Air Forces, returned to acting after World War II. Honestly, I only know of one thing that this guy was ever in. He looked a lot different by then. He had put on a lot of weight. His wife, he blamed it on his wife. His wife was a French cook. And anyway, I would say he's really only known for one show where his accent gives him away. Anybody?
Sergeant Schultz.
Sergeant Schultz, yeah. John Banner, yeah. Yeah, so he sees nothing, he hears nothing, he knows nothing. Colonel Klink, incidentally, was also in the U.S. Army. He fought during the Battle of the Bulge. I can't think of Colonel Klink, the actor who played Colonel Klink.
Werner Klemper.
Yeah, Werner Klemper, thank you. Was also in the U.S. Army.
I watched a lot of TVs.
Yeah. All right. So, this guy. So he followed his older brother into the military as soon as he graduated from high school. Not really a whole lot of story for him. He was in the Army Air Forces. He wanted to become a pilot. He never left the United States. He was still in training when the war ended. Then he followed his brother into acting. Was in a bunch of things, but you know he's kind of like John Banner. He's really, really best known for one role, I would say.
Mission Impossible.
Yeah, what's his name though? Peter Graves. Peter Graves. There you go. Now, who's his brother? There you go, right? So what I love about this photo, by the way, I'm going to back up, is you notice that arm on his shoulder way up high like this. So remember, his brother is 6'7". And the reason he can get away with that is that Peter Graves was 6'4". I mean, this is a very tall family. Graves, by the way, that was his mother's maiden name. So he did not go by Peter Arnest because he figured he didn't want to ride on his brother's coattails. So there you go. But of course, Jim Phelps from Mission Impossible and Captain Over from Airplane, which another, just one of my all-time favorite movies. Okay, this is a good-looking guy. So, joined the Naval Reserves while he was in college in Missouri and started pilot training. Again, not a whole lot to say about him in terms of military service either. Another guy who never left the States. But what's fascinating about him is that this guy, when everybody reveals who he is, it's just hard to imagine this guy being an F-4U Corsair fighter pilot in World War II. It still just blows my mind a little bit. Really only known for one thing. He did the same show for decades. Yeah, very good. Y'all are killing it.
Who is it?
Bob Barker. Yeah, Mr. Have Your Pet Spayed and Neutered was an F-4U Corsair pilot in World War II. Also, he beat up Adam Sandler in Happy Gilmore, which still to this day I think is probably the best 45 seconds of film ever made. All right, so this next one, like I said, some of these are easier than others. They will not get easier than this one. I mean, he came out of the womb looking like that, I think. But so what's interesting about this guy, and yeah, I mean, you all know it, it's Ernest Borgnine, right? I mean, that's a gimme. What's cool about him is that he was already a veteran when World War II started. He had just gotten out of the Navy. So he did a hitch in the Navy. He got out in October 1941. So 2 months later, Pearl Harbor is attacked, and so he goes right back in. So he rejoins in January 1942, and he is a gunner's mate, first-class gunner's mate on a patrol boat, basically like a buck and a quarter, so a little tiny 110 or 125 foot long patrol boat. And basically his job was just to patrol the East Coast. on anti-submarine patrol, which he did for 4 years. So he did that until he was discharged in 1945. So this is another guy who, we're going to talk about a few people in this talk who could kind of never really get away from World War II. So, I mean, McHale's Navy, The Dirty Dozen, plenty of other movies that I'm not thinking of. He made his name on World War II movies. He also maintained a very, very strong connection to the Navy throughout his entire life. And he was made an honorary Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy. So that's the highest enlisted rank in the United States Navy. He was awarded that late in his life. So, pretty cool guy. All right, this next one is also, I would have to say, really very easy. Yeah, come on. Everybody knows this one. All right, so this is another guy who really didn't talk very much about his time in the Navy. What we know is that he was a radio man. He was on a subchaser, and he used the GI Bill to go to Harvard. Right, so pretty well-educated guy. And of course, this is the late, great Fred Gwynne. Yeah.
The radioman rate job that he did was retired several years ago and is now IT specialist.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so of course, Car 54, Where Are You? Great early comedy. Of course, he was Herman Munster, and what I love about this is that for all of those prosthetics that he had to wear for the Munsters, not the chin. He brought the chin with him to work every day. So,
How tall was he?
I don't actually think he was that tall. He wore like platform shoes, really tall platform shoes for that movie.
He's also a Harvard alum.
Yeah. He used the GI Bill to go to Harvard. Yeah. All right, this one another kind of giveaway. Just the look on the face. So this I think is a lot of these have been pretty kind of fun stories so far. This guy is kind of like Rod Serling, in the sense that World War II was particularly tough on him. So he joined the Naval Reserve in 1943, washed out of flight school. He wanted to be a pilot, but he did not succeed in that. And so he was transferred to the V-12 program. So the V-12 program is exactly the same as ASTP. It's just the Navy version of it. So for the Army, you had all safe till peace. For the Navy, it was victory in 12 years or else they'll fight. It was a lot easier to make fun of the Army guys. The Navy one's a little clumsy, I think. So he was commissioned as an ensign, served aboard the USS Pennsylvania, and he was the assistant communications officer. So his job was to decode messages, just radio traffic. So every message that was sent or received on board the ship was encoded, and it was his job to encode or decode messages. However, he was also the junior damage control officer. Pennsylvania was hit by a torpedo at the very, very end of the war, and so his job was to go as salvage officer into that compartment that had been hit by the torpedo and pull out any equipment that could be salvaged and reused. He also had to get the bodies out of the compartment. And this was several hours after the torpedo had hit, and that stayed with him for the rest of his life. So this is another PTSD case, I think. Really famous, again, for one show. He was a television host for, I don't even know how many years, 30-something years? Anybody? I heard it. Johnny Carson, very good. Yeah, 30 years, 1962 to 1992. Pretty impressive.
He used to just pass off his naval service as no big deal.
Yeah.
And he used to talk about it on the show, and guys like Jimmy Stewart were there, and it was almost like he never got out of Iowa or wherever he came from.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of guys were like that. Jack Lemmon was the same way. Jack Lemmon was an ensign on an aircraft carrier in World War II, but at the very, very, very tail end of the war. Okay, this guy. This very in-shape guy. So volunteered 1942, served on a subchaser. So he's, again, his job, much like a couple of guys we talked about, was anti-submarine. So he did the same kind of work as Fred Gwynne and Fortnite. And so what's interesting about this guy is that he was on a PC, which is a patrol craft, which is another very, very small ship. And he had a couple of problems. The biggest one was that he was chronically seasick. As soon as you slipped the dock, he would start throwing up, which is not great for a naval officer. It's hard to make a career as a naval officer if you're constantly throwing up every time the ship starts moving. Not great. The other problem that he had was in February 1944, his ship was conducting training. and they dropped a depth charge over the ship. And what a depth charge is supposed to do, it's just a tin can full of explosives, TNT usually. And you set the depth that you want the charge to explode at, and when it sinks down to that depth, water pressure causes the depth charge to explode. This particular depth charge was either set incorrectly or it was faulty, because as soon as they dropped it into the water, it exploded directly underneath the ship. And it picked him up and threw him into a bulkhead, into a wall. And so he was pretty badly injured. So that, combined with his chronic seasickness, ended his medical career. So he did not serve all the way through the end of the war. He received a medical discharge. Yeah, very good.
Real name is
Isur Danielovich, yeah. We can kind of guess why he changed that. So, but yeah, Isur Danielovich, better known as Kirk Douglas. So, Mr. Spartacus himself.
He also starred in a film called Final Countdown, which was filmed
Sure.
aboard the USS Nimitz.
Yeah.
He played he played the skipper, and ever since then, he's been an honorary skipper for the USS Nimitz, as anointed by the USS Nimitz Association. He played Captain Van Yellen.
Probably a big enough ship that he did not get seasick.
I was on the ship when they were finishing filming it, and got to meet him.
Oh, okay.
Super guy.
Yeah.
His son directed it. Michael Douglas
Yeah.
directed that film.
Wow.
He was very friendly. He was the only member of the cast to fraternize with the crew.
All right, so this next one, I'm sorry to inflict this upon your eyes, but let's just get this one out of the way. Okay, so that is his ID photo from the Navy. Come on. So ruggedly handsome guys like us have hard trouble with that. All right, so I mean, you know, this is the local guy. We all know this. This is Paul Newman. So also a V-12 guy. Washed out, he was colorblind, so he could not be a pilot. So instead, he was an aviation radio man. So he was a radio man gunner on an Avenger torpedo bomber. And he came this close. He was incredibly close to being killed during World War II because he was assigned to the Bunker Hill, which was a fleet carrier, big aircraft carrier. But he had his pilot had an ear infection, and so they couldn't fly over with the rest of the squadron. So the rest of the squadron went over to the Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill was hit by a kamikaze that crashed essentially right into the ready room for the pilots, and most of the men in his squadron were killed. And was it not, if not for his pilot's ear infection, he would have been right there as well. So instead, he served on the USS Hollandia, which was an escort carrier, a CVE, which is basically they took merchant ships and converted them into aircraft carriers. The joke for CVEs, for the guys that served on them, so CVE is arcane Navy talk for a small aircraft carrier. Carrier, heavier than air, escort. But they used to say that CVE stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. There you go. When you get home, what do you do now? Everybody has phones. If you search for pictures of the Hollandia, you will see them celebrating the news that Japan has surrendered. And you see a great picture of him just celebrating with the rest of the crew before he was, you know, that. So. Went on to serve with, you know, with this other just barely passable looking guy in a couple of movies. The Sting, I would say probably top 3 all-time favorite movies for me personally. But anyway, so yeah, Paul Newman. Yes, sir.
Paul Newman was also known as a Hellraiser.
Yeah.
When they went on shore on Liberty, he got in a lot of trouble.
Sure. Well, you know, he's a race car driver and a salad dressing guy, and you can't be too careful with salad dressing guys. All right, next up. Excuse me. Yeah, this good-looking guy. All right, so he desperately wanted to be on a submarine. So he wanted to serve on submarines, so the Navy did the next best thing. They put him on a subtender. And a subtender is a surface ship that carries torpedoes and food and spare parts and stuff. And they basically do all the repair work for the guys that are on submarines. But he was a signalman. He was in Tokyo Bay when Japan surrendered, but the ship he was on was probably 25 miles away from where the action was. So, I mean, of course, hundreds of thousands of people could say they were in Tokyo Bay for the surrender, as could Tony Curtis. That's Tony Curtis, by the way. But Tony Curtis did not see the signature of the surrender document any more than I did. But he was a lot closer to it than I was. All right, so again, pretty successful career. If you can dress like that and still be successful, that says something for you. But there he is, again, with Jack Lemmon, who is also, he was an officer, he was an ensign in the Navy in World War II, and Bronson. All right, next up, we're getting into the Marines now. All right, so enlisted right after Pearl Harbor, much like Bob Barker, he was a Corsair pilot, but he was really good at it. In fact, he was so good at it that they kept him in the States, and he served the war as an instructor. He finally got orders to go overseas, but the war ended before he got there. Went on to fly artillery spotting missions, which means he was basically flying a Cessna over enemy lines and watching artillery shells basically fly over his plane and then land on enemy positions, and then he would radio back corrections to the artillery guys. Retired as a colonel from the Marine Reserves in 1966, and then went on to a very long and successful career in television. Very good. Nothing gets by y'all. Ed McMahon. So there you go. So both of the main guys on the Johnny Carson Tonight Show were retired officers. And of course, Star Search. Everybody remembers Star Search. All right, next up. This guy. Again, not as these go, not that hard of one. All right. Enlisted in 1942, served in the 4th Marine Division. He was badly wounded in Saipan. He was hit by machine gun fire in Saipan and discharged in 1945. He spent more than a year in a hospital. So he had a pretty serious wound. And anyway, from there he went on to have a long, successful career in acting. Famous as a tough guy, though he played the violin quite well, as I understand it. But, you know, famous guy because he went white. His hair went white at a very young age. Everybody? Lee Marvin. Okay, so Lee Marvin, real quick. When the internet was first kind of taking off, you probably all remember this one. There is a very famous story, an urban legend, if you will, that he was on Johnny Carson's show. And he told a story about when he stormed Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima in 1945. He ran into another Marine who was the best and bravest Marine he ever saw. And that guy also went on to a long and successful career in Hollywood. And that guy was Bob Keeshan, Captain Kangaroo. Okay? The only part of that story that is true is that Mount Suribachi is on Iwo Jima. So Lee Marvin never served on Iwo Jima. He was on Saipan, Kwajalein, and Inuitak. And Bob Keeshan was a Marine, but he was still training in the U.S. when the war ended. So there you go. Sorry to burst that bubble for you.
He was still telling that story in 1975 when I had a chance to talk to him.
Yeah. All right, so there you go. There's another Dirty Dozen connection for you. So that's Ward 9 as well. Paint Your Wagon, which is a kind of off-character movie for him, but good movie. All right, this is one of my favorites for obvious reasons. So when the Marine Corps decided they were going to allow women in, she was not first in line, but she was very, very close in 1943. She started out operating a typewriter at an air station. She had some discipline trouble. She was kind of a tough person, and so they made her a truck driver because she could work on her own and not get in other people's way. And then she went on to a long, successful career as an actress. Yeah, very good. Maud, yeah, B. Arthur. So B. Arthur was a Marine in World War II. There you go. All right, so this next one, I will admit we're going to cheat a little bit because strictly speaking, this is not a World War II veteran, but it was too cool to pass up. So we're going to do that, I believe, in 2 occasions. All right, this good-looking guy. So enlisted in 1947. So again, World War II is already over. He had run away from home. He trained as a tank driver. What's interesting to him is that he would get promoted and he would get busted down. And then he would get promoted and then he would get busted down. And he would get promoted and then he would get busted down. Despite all of that, he actually rescued 2 men from a tank. They were doing an exercise and it submerged in water, and he pulled 2 guys out of the tank. And for that, he was put on Truman's presidential yacht, the Sequoia, as one of the guard of honor. And again, despite his career path looking like this, he got an honorary discharge, honorable discharge in 1950. Any guesses? Very good. Yeah, Steve McQueen. Yeah, Steve McQueen was a Marine from 1947 to 1950. Sand Pebbles, by the way, if you've never seen it, fantastic movie, absolutely phenomenal movie.
In Hell is for Heroes, he played the disciplinary case.
Hell for Heroes is a great movie. Yeah.
It's intense.
Years ahead of its time, too. Yeah. Jeez, y'all are, come on, guys. All right, so he lied to enlist. He lied about his age, enlisted when he was only 16, sent to China as part of the 2nd Marine Division, re-upped, and ended up staying in the Marine Corps until 1954. And looks a whole lot like Sean Penn, like a young Sean Penn. But yeah, so I've already heard it, so we'll just jump right ahead. So yeah, Gene Hackman. So also a U.S. Marine. French Connection, really great movie. The Popeyes, the restaurant chain, I know this because I lived in New Orleans for a long time. That's where Popeyes is based. Not named for the Sailor Man, it's named for Popeye from the French Connection. There you go. And then of course he was the, what was he, a monk, I think? Something like that?
Blind monk.
Blind monk, yeah. I was going to make espresso. Now, interestingly enough, this is a movie that's going to come up a couple of times. So he played the Polish General Sosabowski in Bridge Too Far, which I think is one of the greatest anti-war movies ever made. You're going to see it at least one more time in this talk. But looks, did a pretty good job of looking like the real guy. If you've never seen A Bridge Too Far, I can't imagine anybody in this room has not. If you haven't seen it, you owe it to yourself to see that one.
Sir?
Yeah.
Hackman was pictured in the New York Post 2 or 3 days ago.
I saw that.
And nobody in the world would recognize Gene Hackman. He looked worse by far than you just saw him in the Frankenstein movie. He's in his 90s, and you look like he had gone through a rigor. It's just a horrible, horrible thing. And he's 92 or something?
Something like that, yeah.
And it was a shame that they let the picture run. Because everybody has an image of him, and then you see this photograph. It was on the, I think it was on the front page of the New York Post.
Yeah, that's the first time he's been seen in several years, and I can understand why, I guess, because of that image. Incidentally, when he stopped acting, he became a writer and is a very, very successful novelist, by the way. I've never read any of his stuff, but he is a very accomplished novelist. Okay, so this guy. All right, joined the Merchant Marine at age 16 at the very, very tail end of World War II. So, the Merchant Marine is kind of a tricky situation. They were not recognized as being basically military veterans until decades after World War II. But they had arguably the most dangerous job you could have. So these are the guys that served on merchant ships carrying everything from tanks to toilet paper that was made in the United States and used overseas. Got there because of these guys who received essentially no credit from the federal government for what they did until long after a lot of them had already died. So I'm a big fan of the Merchant Marine. They don't get their just rewards, I think. Anyway, so joined the National Guard. Much like Mr. Danielovich, he was also chronically seasick, and so life at sea did not agree with him. He served in Korea, so this is, I believe, the only Korean War veteran we're going to talk about today. Was wounded twice, once by friendly fire, and he was the scrounger for his unit. He was the guy that could find everything, which he carried over into, I would say, one of his most famous roles. I'd say he's probably best known for two things.
James Garner?
Yeah, very good. James Garner, Maverick, of course. And then in The Great Escape, where he was the scrounger for Stalag Luft 3. Who is the guy on his right?
Donald Pleasance.
Donald Pleasance. So interesting fact about Donald Pleasance is that he did not have to research being a POW in World War II for The Great Escape because he was a German POW in World War II. He was, I believe, a radio operator, either a radio operator or a gunner on a Lancaster. And after flying something like 80 or 100 missions, he was shot down, and he spent the rest of the war at Stalag Luft 1, way up on the North Sea. This is, I think, one of my favorite photos, just because the image that people have of this guy, it's just hard to imagine him being this young and this fit. All right, so he tried to enlist, so the first little tidbit there is just going to give this away. Couldn't serve in the military because he had a glass eye. And what's interesting about this guy is that he spent his entire youth desperately trying to get into wars and he kept missing. So he couldn't serve in World War II because he had a glass eye. He tried to join the Israeli army to fight against Egypt, but the war was already over by the time he got there. Really only known, I would say, for one role. Yeah, of course. So who was Columbo? Peter Falk, very good. Peter Falk was in very good shape in his youth. Also the grandfather in The Princess Bride, which is probably, like, again, top 3 movies for me. All right, so now we are getting out of the United States. So he was already acting. He was a pretty famous stage actor, British stage actor. Volunteered for the Royal Navy. He commanded a landing craft in the invasions of Sicily and Elba. He ended the war carrying supplies to partisans in Yugoslavia, and he ended up in Broadway in the United States to do like propaganda type plays. Went on, again, like everybody we're going to talk about here, had a very, very distinguished career. Is best known for a movie that he absolutely despised. Anybody?
Alec Guinness.
Alec Guinness, very good. Obi-Wan Kenobi was the captain of a landing craft in World War II. Bridge on the River Kwai, again, absolutely phenomenal war movie. And again, Star Wars, which, I mean, was the low point of his career as far as he was concerned. He did cash those checks, though. All right, so this is, I think, probably the most interesting person, the most interesting man in the world, so to speak. This is another guy who desperately wanted to fight in a war. The difference is he actually did it. So he went to Finland and served in the Winter War in 1939. So he fought the Soviets before World War II, then joined the RAF. He was sent to North Africa as an intelligence officer. Then he decided that that was not exciting enough, so he joined the Army instead. He transferred over to the Army just in time to fight at Monte Cassino, which was about the worst place you could be at that time. Then he went back to the RAF as a staff officer. When the war ended, he decided to help hunt down Nazis that were trying to get out of Germany because among the 7 languages that he spoke German. Went on to become a very successful actor across several genres, probably best known for pretty schlocky, cheap, bad movies. Very good. That's Sir Christopher Lee to you. But yeah, so the only person to play Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, and the Mummy. So not even Bela Lugosi or the other guy whose name is escaping me right now, but you all know. Thank you, Boris Karloff. Neither of them did that, but he did. To younger audiences, he is probably best known as Saruman from The Lord of the Rings. He was also Count Dooku in the new Star Wars movies. My personal favorite is that he released a series of heavy metal Christmas albums. I have listened to them. They are something. So yeah, rock on, Christopher Lee.
He's having a good time.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the name of the movie, but he went over to correct the director to tell him what it sounded like when somebody was sticking a knife into their back, you know, and how it slithered.
Yeah, that's a really famous, that was Lord of the Rings. That he was talking to Peter Jackson about that, yeah. If you couldn't hear it, so he corrected Peter Jackson on what the sound of somebody being stabbed should be, because he knew firsthand. He also personally knew J.R.R. Tolkien. And he actually, like, the languages that you see in these movies, he could speak those languages. So, pretty impressive guy. All right, next up is this guy, this good-looking young guy. So he is a Canadian. That is the 3rd Canadian Division patch that you see up there, which is about the least exciting patch you could possibly have. But the Canadians pulled it off. So he landed on Juno Beach on D-Day. So this is a D-Day veteran. Not only that, this is a D-Day hero. The story has kind of grown in the retelling over the years. The story as it exists today is basically that he single-handedly liberated a French town. It's not quite that exciting, but he was a genuine D-Day hero. Unfortunately, he was shot by friendly fire. He was shot 6 times by his own men. He was hit by a Bren gun, which is a British light machine gun. He was hit a couple of times in the leg. He had a finger shot off of his right hand, and he had a bullet that would have gone through his heart, except this really does happen. it hit a cigarette case and was deflected. And so he was wounded in the chest, but he was not killed. He spent the rest of the war as an artillery observer pilot, so he did the same thing that McMahon did. And he was called the craziest pilot in the Canadian Air Force because he would fly under telegraph or telephone wires and stuff. So, I would say this guy is really only known for one thing. Yeah, somebody knows.
Scotty. Jimmy Doohan.
Yeah, very good. That's Scotty from Star Trek. James Doohan. Jimmy Doohan is an honest-to-God D-Day hero. Now, interesting fact, if you look at the picture on the left, you notice you don't see his right hand. He tried very, very hard throughout his acting career never to show his right hand on screen because he lost a finger on D-Day. There's only a couple of scenes that you can see in Star Trek where you can see his right hand. And that's why. All right. This young lady. So, born to Nazi-sympathizing parents in Belgium, so she did not get along too well with her parents. She was living in Arnhem when A Bridge Too Far happened, so when Operation Market Garden happened, she was living in Arnhem when all that fighting was going on. She was really very young to be doing this, but she was helping the Dutch resistance by carrying messages, carrying supplies, that sort of thing on her bicycle. She was, came this close to dying in World War II because as reprisals, an awful lot of Dutch civilians in Arnhem helped the British every way they could during and after Market Garden. And so when Market Garden collapsed, basically what happened was the Germans surrounded Arnhem and then just starved the city to death. And so tens of thousands of people died in Arnhem as a result of helping the British in Market Garden. And again, she came this close to dying as one of these people in Market Garden in 1944. Yeah, of course. Audrey Hepburn, member of the Dutch resistance in World War II. Okay, I think of all the stories we're going to tell today, this is probably my personal favorite. So this guy joined the British Army in 1941, commissioned in 42, volunteered for the paratroop regiment, jumped into Normandy on D-Day. Now, of course, this is a World War II crowd. So he participated in the capture of Pegasus Bridge. Pegasus Bridge was a very small bridge that linked the British sector, so where the British paratroopers were jumping to the east of the British beaches. Pegasus Bridge was the connecting link between the British paratroopers and the British beaches. And so if that bridge was not taken, then the British Airborne Division would be completely cut off and surrounded. If that bridge was not taken, it would also allow Germans to get reinforcements and soldiers onto the British beaches, probably before the British had enough people to turn them back. So the capture of Pegasus Bridge was one of the most important things to happen on D-Day. It was the first combat that happened. The commander of the British soldiers that captured Pegasus Bridge was a man named John Howard. So they landed in gliders and they captured the bridge. This guy's job, he commanded the paratroopers that were supposed to relieve and reinforce the men that captured Pegasus Bridge. So one of the most important jobs you could have on D-Day, this is the guy that was in charge of it. So he stayed with the airborne all the way through the end of the war. He had already started acting before World War II, because really kind of just getting started when the war started. Went back to acting after the war. Had a very long and successful career as a British actor in film and television. I would say he's probably only known for American audiences for one movie.
The Longest Day.
Longest Day. What's his name, though?
Richard Todd.
Very good, man. All right, so Richard Todd is his name. So he was in The Longest Day, which is the movie about D-Day. And in that role, when he auditioned for the movie, they said, well, who are you, what'd you do, all that. He said, well, I actually commanded the guys that reinforced Pegasus Bridge on D-Day. He said, well, do you want to play yourself? He said, no. He says, I am not far enough along in my career to take so small a role. So in The Longest Day, he plays John Howard. So he plays the man that was responsible for capturing Pegasus Bridge. So this is a still from that movie. And what you're seeing is Richard Todd on the left playing John Howard. And Richard Todd on the left playing John Howard is talking to an actor playing Richard Todd on the right. And so what you're seeing here through the magic of Hollywood is Richard Todd talking to himself from 20 years ago on D-Day when it's not D-Day, right? So Hollywood is amazing.
Didn't he marry Elizabeth Taylor?
Did he marry Elizabeth Taylor? Mike Todd. There you go. So the answer is no. All right, next up you have this guy. Already heard. So, again, another, strictly speaking, not World War II veteran, but this one's just fun, so we're going to throw it in there. Enlisted at the age of 17, realized almost immediately that he had made a huge mistake. He did not want to be in the military. A couple of good things that came out of it, though, is that he took up weightlifting and bodybuilding, and that's actually where his career path was going. I mean, he was a professional bodybuilder before he became an actor. Was discharged in 1950 because he had an ulcer, but he was trained as an anti-aircraft gunner in the Royal Navy, and became, one of the leading men of Hollywood for decades. And I already heard it, so we'll just put it up there. Sean Connery. So, best known for playing a British, English super secret agent with a Scottish accent. A Soviet submarine captain with a Scottish accent, and if you've seen the movie Highlander, somehow a 5,000-year-old Egyptian named Ramirez with a Scottish accent. But to get back to Bridge Too Far, he played Urquhart, so he played the commander of the British Airborne Division that jumped into Arnhem, and his Urquhart's daughters were just over the moon by that fact. All right, so this is another, this one might be pretty tough, but it's a very, very cool story. It's a very sad story, but it's a very cool story. All right, so this is another man. He was a very successful stage actor who was just getting into film acting when the war started. He served on the Prince of Wales. Again, this is a World War II crowd, so Prince of Wales was the ship that was with the Hood when the Hood was blown up by the Bismarck in 1941. So he was an assistant gunnery officer. His battle station was directly above the pilot house, so he stood right on top of the bridge. And right after the Hood was destroyed, the Bismarck fired a 15-inch shell that hit one side of the pilot house, went all the way through the other side, and exploded directly outside the pilot house. Every man on the bridge were killed except for 2 men. And he lost an eye, lost 90% of his vision in his other eye, had several other wounds. And despite all of that, of course, that was the end of his military service, but he went back to acting. And so he had several successful surgeries over the years that he ended up getting, something like 15 or 20% of his vision back. But for the rest of his life, he had to have somebody read scripts to him over and over and over and over again, and he had to memorize entire scripts, word for word, for his acting career, just by having them read to him because he couldn't read them himself. So does anybody know this guy's name? Again, he had a long career, but I'd say he's probably best known for one quick role. So his name is Esmond Knight. And what is fascinating about Esmond Knight is that he played the captain of the Prince of Wales in Sink the Bismarck. And so he, again, to American audiences, is best known for recreating what was without a doubt the absolute worst moment of his life. All right, so now we're going to talk about a couple of people who could not get away from World War II, at least for American audiences, no matter how hard they tried. All right, so this is a guy who was a young man in Germany when the war started. So he served because he was about as Aryan looking as they come, just perfectly blonde hair, blue-eyed. Served in propaganda films, was on recruiting posters, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so he ended up serving in the military, and his story has kind of, it's kind of hard to nail down. The way he described it is that, he got to the front lines, he didn't want to fight. And so the first night he was in the front lines, he ran away and surrendered. That's probably not what happened, but he did not serve in the front lines long before he was captured, because he got there right at the very, very tail end of the war. But again, he is best known for American audience for being that German soldier. Pretty much every movie you can think of that has Germans in it, he was probably one of those Germans. And I already heard it. Maybe not necessarily that well known, but Hardy Kruger. So he was the bad guy in A Bridge Too Far. He was kind of an amalgam of the commander of the 2 SS divisions that were at Arnhem. And he played Rommel in War and Remembrance.
All right, so then you have this guy. So, raised in Manchuria, and his parents were both killed during World War II. He was a keen photographer, also became a pilot, so he was a photo reconnaissance pilot. And like I said, both of his parents were killed in U.S. bombing of Japan during World War II. But again, went on to a long and successful career, particularly in Japanese films. Best known, I would say, without a doubt, for samurai movies. But again, for American audiences, he is known as that guy that was in the World War II movie with Japanese sailors. Does anybody know his name? You'll recognize it. Toshiro Mifune? Anybody? Yeah, so he was Yamamoto in Midway. My personal favorite, he was the commander of the Japanese submarine in 1941, which was Steven Spielberg's failed comedy about World War II. Great movie. Not the kind of movie you could make today, but great movie. And also with, who's the guy on the left? Christopher Lee. Yeah, he was the German officer on the Japanese submarine. You just need to watch the movie. It still won't make sense, but you just need to watch the movie. All right, so there are a couple of people, oh geez, I was killing myself, that we should mention. All right, so Audie Murphy, of course. Tried to enlist right after Pearl Harbor, but he was turned down by every branch because he was the runt of the litter. I mean, he was really only about that tall. He weighed like 108 pounds soaking wet. But as the war went on and the U.S. started to suffer more and more casualties and we needed more and more men, the standards for which we accepted men into the military started to get relaxed. And so finally he was allowed to enlist, and it worked out pretty well for us that he did. So served in the 3rd Infantry Division, same as Jim Arness. Landed in Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, southern France, received the Medal of Honor. I mean, you know, awarded 29 military medals before his 20th birthday. I mean, he is a super soldier. Also, without a doubt, suffered from PTSD. He had a lot of alcohol problems, gambling problems after World War II. They had to really twist his arm to make To Hell and Back, by the way, because he did not want to make a movie about himself. They convinced him to make this movie because it would be about honoring the men that he served with, rather than making a movie about himself. And so he finally agreed to do it. Unfortunately killed in a plane crash, helicopter crash, plane crash. Learjet, yeah, plane crash, when he was still much too young. But yeah, Audie Murphy, so incredibly successful. Yes?
How old was he when he joined the service?
He would have been, let's see, 1925, he joined in 42, so 18? Yeah. All right. Okay, so we have this guy. So this is an old photo because this was an old guy. So this is a World War I veteran. So he served on the Somme. He was very lightly wounded. He became an actor in between the wars. And when World War II started, he decided he wanted to be like in USO shows and that sort of thing. But he ended up being assigned to the pay corps instead. So he was he just handed out soldiers' pay. And he would have been just completely resigned to history as just another guy. Except he had one remarkable trait that was recognized by David Niven. So going all the way back to the very beginning. I'm going to just tell you this guy's name. His name is Merrick Edward Clifton James. Does anybody know who that is? Okay, his one remarkable trait is if you dress this guy up just right, he looked exactly like Field Marshal Montgomery. And so his job during World War II was, if the British were going to attack over here, the Germans looked at Montgomery the same way they looked at Patton. Wherever those guys were, that's where the action was going to be. And so what they would do is they would send Clifton James over here, and he would look just like Montgomery. And he would make absolutely sure that everybody saw him. And so the Germans would expect an attack from Montgomery over here, when in reality, Montgomery is over here, and he's going to attack from this one. And so that's his job. He was a body double in World War II, and he was actually really good at it, as you can see.
Except that they had to keep him away from the bottle.
Yeah. Well, nobody's
He
perfect.
was a teetotaler, and Clifton James was very much the opposite.
Okay, so there's one person we have not talked about yet, and we do have to make sure we cover him. And that is, of course, the one and only John Wayne.
who jumped into Normandy on D-Day. He fought with the Seabees on Guadalcanal. He landed on Iwo Jima and was there for the flag raising. He also fought on Bataan and somehow was not captured. He flew with the Flying Tigers. He also flew with the Marines on Guadalcanal when he was already fighting on Guadalcanal with the Seabees. He commanded a PT boat. He also commanded a submarine. And he commanded a heavy cruiser. And he did all that without serving a single day in the military. So there's an interesting story that has grown up about John Wayne over the years, and that is, how much of this is true I don't really know, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway because it's a fun story. And that is, you know, the war starts, he decides he's going to serve because he is, you know, he's Mr. America. But what happens is, you know, Hollywood approaches him and said, look, you want to serve, that's great. Make this movie first because, you know, it would be great for morale if, you know, the most famous actor in Hollywood makes this pro-America propaganda film. Make this movie and then go fight, don't worry about it. So he made that film. Then they said, well, okay, wait, before you go, make this movie and then go. Okay, fine. So he makes this movie, and then he makes that movie, and then he makes that movie, and then he makes that movie, that movie, that movie, and so on. And finally he says, that's enough, all right? I am going to serve. And so the story goes, what he decided to do, the way he would best serve his country, is by joining the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor of the CIA. So, super secret spy stuff. Arguably the most recognizable face on planet Earth decided that the best way he could serve was to become a secret agent. And so the story goes that he applied to the OSS and he was accepted. But he was also going through a particularly acrimonious divorce. And so the letter arrived at his house. His soon-to-be ex-wife got the letter and threw it away. And so he served the entire war without knowing that he had been accepted into the OSS. I don't know if any of that is true. But again, it's too good a story not to share with you good people. And yeah, that's my talk. So we're done.